This is Will Tchakirides interviewing Ajamu Dillahunt for the HBCU Radio Preservation Project. It is 10:30 a.m. on November 14th, 2024. This interview is being recorded in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina at the Earfluence Studios. Okay, Ajamu, I'm going to start with some questions around your early life.
Sure.
Tell me, if you can, when and where you were born.
So I was born in 1945, August 16th, just at the end of World War II. And that particular date has significance in connection with the bombing of Japan to end the war. And so every year when people kind of reflect on the horrible results of that bombing and whatnot, it's around the time of my birthday too. And so it's just that kind of thinking. But it was 1945, and my folks were celebrating two things.
Yeah, where were you born?
So in Brooklyn, New York.
Okay.
Lived in Brooklyn until 1954. I think 4 of those years was spent in the Marcy Projects, and I mention that only because younger people know the Marcy Projects from Jay-Z growing up there. But yeah, Brooklyn was where I was born.
And what were your parents' names?
Yeah, my mom was Carrie Harris, was her maiden name, and my dad was Amos Dillahunt.
And what did your parents do for work, or how did they spend their time?
Yeah, so they were workers, all their lives. My dad did a number of things. He migrated from New Bern, North Carolina, and found his way to Brooklyn after spending a couple of months with the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression. Made enough money to get a watch and a bus ticket to New York City to join his family. They had been there. So he did a number of things, but I think his main work for most of his working life was with the post office. He got a job in the late 40s, early 50s with the Postal Service, and he retired from there. Mom did a number of different jobs. I mean, one that I recall her talking about was working in food service in a public school for a while. And then she worked for the telephone company. She was a telephone operator, and then spent the bulk of her working years as a clerk in a hospital in New York City. She was there. She was a member of, I think, 1190. No, I think it was DC 35, District Council 35 of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So she was a union member, not an activist, but a member.
And your father as well?
Yeah, he was a member of the organization that allowed black postal workers to be part of it, the National Alliance, and that was a union for black workers, and he was part of that during his time as a worker on the floor. He later on got into a kind of administrative job, not really supervisory, but an administrative job. But he was part of that. And just as a little aside, in terms of his involvement with that, a friend of mine, a historian, was doing a book on postal workers, and was going through some records of meeting minutes of a meeting, and up pops my father's name, not for making a big contribution to the meeting, but he won the lottery that they had that day, or the drawing for something, and his Amos Dillahunt, wins and whatnot. So it was at least proof that he really was a member of the union. But yeah, that was his work for most of my life. He had always had 2 or 3 jobs, though, always part-time jobs, selling furniture, whatever, but always had 2 jobs.
And he was from New Bern. I apologize if you mentioned, but your mother, was she?
She's from Brooklyn. She was born in Brooklyn, but her mom came from Charleston, South Carolina. They migrated from Charleston, part of the Great Migration, and she and her two sisters.
And when were they born? Your parents?
So mom is 1922, and my dad was 1919.
And they came up in that sort of 30s, 40s wartime migration up north.
Exactly, at least with Dad. Like I say, I think it was 35, 37, somewhere that he migrated, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you're talking about the fact that black postal workers had to form a separate organization to collectivize. I'm thinking about the discrimination that they experienced as service workers, as city workers working for the state. How did they talk about discrimination in the house? Was race or racism a topic of conversation in your household growing up?
Yeah, so, it's not like my folks weren't race, like my dad wasn't a race man, so to speak, or my mom. And so it wasn't like a constant conversation going on. But when things would come up that reflected some racism, either in their personal lives and interactions with other white people as individuals or even institutions, I mean, they talk about it. They call it out. The news, certainly Emmett Till was something that everybody talked about as part of discrimination. And then during the developing civil rights movement, talked about segregation in the South and the fight against it, and probably the Montgomery bus boycott was something that was talked about, and just not in huge ways. Like, we didn't have like big conversations at the dinner table or whatever, but yeah, just that way. So,
but as an adolescent, you remember the Montgomery bus boycott, and you would have been around 12 or 13.
Yes. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now, I do want to know a bit more about the place that you grew up, or if you moved around a bit in Brooklyn at all. Tell me what Marcy Projects were like.
Well, so before we moved into Marcy Projects, we lived in a number of places in the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn. That's everybody now, the hippies, and a lot of gentrification going on, and the characters changing. But that's really a historically black area in Brooklyn. And so we lived in 3 or 4 different places that I can remember before we moved into public housing. And at that time, I'm just recalling that was an important kind of thing, because it was, good housing, it was safe housing, and people saw it as a kind of stepping stone. I think the attitude was we'll be here for a while, and then we'll move into something better. And of course, as I recall, they were fairly new at the time that we moved in there, and so in pretty good shape and whatnot. But it's like people think of it as low income housing, affordable housing. As I recall, a number of the people that lived there were civil servants, like my dad was at the time. Worked for transit, some probably for the police department, fire department. Although those numbers weren't that high at that time, just in terms of the department, particularly the fire department. But those sanitation, they had those kinds of jobs. So it was a place that people stayed in for a while and then kind of moved on. And as I reflect on some of the kids that I grew up with later on in Queens, in St. Albans, right, which was a community where people came from Brooklyn, or they came from Harlem, or maybe some from the Bronx. But I just, I remember a lot of folks from Brooklyn and Queens, and Harlem rather. But their parents, were civil service workers in the main, and had moved from the projects, all the projects across Brooklyn or Manhattan and whatnot. People could identify with them.
Before we move forward too much, did you have siblings?
Yeah, so I've got a younger brother, Richard. He was born in 1950. while we were still in the Marcy houses. And I just recall being excited about having a baby brother to play with and to wrestle with and fight with and whatnot. So we're pretty close, even though there was a 5-year difference between us. We grew up pretty close. And during our teenage years, when I was in high school, I ran track. And so my brother used to come to all the track meets, and to this day we reminisce about those days. And we couldn't recall whether my mother made me take him, or that I asked to bring him. But in any case, he came and whatnot. And so we laugh about that. But we had a good relationship growing up, and to this day we do. We're still close.
And what did you and Richard and other friends that you had do for fun? What did you like to do socially within New York?
Well, in the lower grades, and those years, we on the street in a kind of suburban neighborhood in St. Albans. I don't think I mentioned that we moved to St. Albans, Queens, and we'd play on the street. We'd ride bikes. We'd skate. Basketball and football on empty lots that were existing at that time. We would do some of that, and then schoolyard kinds of activities with a couple of nearby parks. And that's sort of basic thing, those areas of sport, and not a lot of music or anything in those early years, but that, later on we're listening. And, as we think about this radio kind of stuff, we're talking about radio, I kind of think back to the radio that we used to listen to at that time, which kind of helped to shape our musical taste and so on.
Yeah, I did want to ask, was the radio on in the house or in the community? And if you remember any particular stations or DJs or styles?
Yeah, so radio in the house for sure. I think the AM station WWRL, a station that played rhythm and blues, and then they had a gospel portion, and then later on sometimes some jazz. But it was mainly R&B and gospel. And my grandmother lived with us, my mother's mom. She was at home all the time, kind of watching us sometimes, and she didn't work by the time we lived in Queens, but she had the gospel music on all the time. So that was our exposure to gospel music. The radio station, though, there's another one I'm trying to think of that played jazz music late at night. Was a DJ called Symphony Sid Torin, and his program where he broadcast live sometime from Birdland, which was something, and so we would listen to him, and then later on they had a Latin hour that on that same station, and got familiar with Latin music. Now, the traction to Symphony Sid didn't come through just something out of the sky. The basis for it was my dad. He was a music fan, a jazz fan, a collector, wannabe musician. And so he introduced that music. That jazz music was always present in the house all the time. He had this huge collection of 78 records. And part of it, he worked for a time at a record store in Manhattan, and part of his job, besides selling the records, was to take records home and listen. And so when customers came in, he could actually, make a recommendation. You ought to check this out by Lester Young, or the Roy Eldridge did this. Check this out. So.
And did you develop an early interest and appreciation as well?
Yeah, really did. And I started playing the saxophone, which he had probably the first organized lessons. I was in the 5th grade, and took lessons all the way through high school, and played in kids bands, local bands. We tried to put together playing jazz. I played in the school band and the orchestra, and did that up through high school, just a little bit in college. But yeah, I was definitely a big fan, and kind of hung out with a core of folks, young people that like jazz. I mean, we weren't we weren't the average, group of folks listening to music at that time, but we had this taste for jazz, and we used to meet and listen to music. We used to go and sneak into Birdland or whatever. So yeah,
you saw it live from time to time.
Yeah.
I did want to ask, what were the racial demographics, class demographics like within the neighborhoods that you lived in New York? How did it change as you moved around the city?
Mm-hmm. Well, I could say one thing, in living in Brooklyn in the Marcy houses at that age. Of course, I'm talking fourth grade, so I'm not sure, but I remember some of the demographics in that. In the projects there, definitely working class, and racially pretty mixed. I remember our neighbor was Italian, right? A couple of Puerto Rican families, and so it was that kind of mix at that time. And of course, I say working class because that's the housing was designed. That was the programs, the public housing programs at that era. Call for that, and so it was pretty well integrated at that time. We moved to Queens and into a neighborhood that was almost totally white. I think we were maybe the second or third family, and within the span of maybe 2 years, it had completely transitioned to being a black neighborhood, and just one or two white families that were left. And that wasn't just our block, but the whole community, all of the areas, St. Albans, Springfield Gardens, Hollis, those areas went through that same kind of change. And so that you find black families there, working class, middle class folks, all kind of in that area in South Queens, Southern Queens. That is how we recall it, and it's kind of interesting. Mix of things. St. Albans, which I mentioned, is like a historic home. Count Basie lived there. Lester Young lived there. I think Roy Campanella was there at one time. Just any number of folks. James Brown had a house there, and that's an area where some of the entertainers and more well-off black folks lived. But in the surrounding areas, other black families, lower middle class, working class families lived there too.
Thank you. Where did you attend school in New York? And you can move through the different schools that you attended.
Yeah, so, I think I went to... from kindergarten through the third grade in Brooklyn. So at PS 54, I remember that for sure. And then moved to Queens for the third grade, and moved in the middle of the school year in January or February, and went to school PS 110. And what was unique about it was a wooden schoolhouse with, I believe, 6 classrooms in it. It just nothing else like it existed that we knew of or ever saw. And went there for third grade and fourth grade. We've been trying to do research on that school, and haven't come up with the kind of information we want. It's like it didn't exist. Everybody who went there knows about it, but trying to find records of it in the archives has been kind of difficult. But yeah, that was a kind of close, group of people who became friends and lived in the neighborhood. Used to walk home from school, and it was a kind of fun. It was a big lot. Empty lot behind the school where we had recess and whatnot. So that was it. Then I went to PS 15, which from the fifth grade through the 6th grade, and then junior high school, 59 from 7th grade through the 9th grade, and then finally high school at Andrew Jackson, which is in Cambria Heights. And kind of interesting thing about Andrew Jackson, at that time, you're going to Jackson. We were on a track team with the old Hickories, and, it was something you were kind of proud of, just to be at that school. Bob Cousy had played basketball there at Jackson. Jackson always had top-notch track teams, which I ended up getting on one during my time there. But little did we know about the hard history of Andrew Jackson. And it's kind of unique because I loved history, and those are the classes that I really remember, but I don't remember any discussion of Andrew Jackson in that kind of way, or at least that my consciousness had me, challenge that and question that and so and whatnot. But yeah, Andrew Jackson is where I went.
And it sounds like history may have been your favorite subject in school?
Absolutely.
And what do you recall learning about history as a youth?
Well, I think the early it's kind of interesting, but the early parts of the civil rights movement we studied, and I started to think about high school students 3 or 4 years from now, or maybe even currently, even being exposed to that history at all. But we were, and so that was kind of interesting. And we didn't have a course on Black history or Negro history at the time or whatever, but just generally the South, what was going on in the South, and so on. And then, frankly, I was interested in the wars, the World War I, World War II. I don't remember actually much of the Korean War. Not much history had been written probably by then. This is in the early '60s, but World War II and World War I were kind of interesting pieces to me in terms of history. Yeah, and the little touching on history of other countries of Europe and so on, not on Africa or the Middle East. That wasn't part of the curriculum that I could remember. But just kind of looking back, that was what I liked. Yeah.
As a high school student, could you feel that absence of Black history?
Well, yes and no, for the most part. But one of the teachers, Miss Watson, she's a black middle-aged black woman. I remember her. She was very serious. Lived in a neighborhood, not in my immediate neighborhood, but in the neighborhood of some other friends. And she was a history teacher, and so she kind of introduced the civil rights movement. But then I think in my senior year, I had a teacher, Mr. Vernon, who, as I recall, might have been British on that. But my project for that year was to write a paper on Black nationalism, and I had seen the TV program, the Mike Wallace interview on a Nation of Islam, and saw Malcolm X for the first time on that TV show, and was kind of impressed by that, and went on to write this paper on Black nationalism. I remember, I think I got a B and didn't challenge it. I don't remember what his critique was of the paper, but it was something I had to dig into 2 books on Islam and the Black community, and I think Yusemi Yudam wrote that book with two pieces that I read on that, and so I did have a little bit of that. And then Jackson also had a human relations club that, interestingly, was coordinated by our track team coach, Mr. Blatt. He taught English. He coached the track team, and he had this human relations club. And
was Mr. Black?
No, he wasn't. And so, he was kind of laid back, let people just let it all out. And we just talked about what was going on in the country and so on. And what I do remember, there was a white guy in the class, and I do remember his name, but I'm not gonna say now what his name was, 'cause I don't know what he did afterwards and how he would want to be remembered. But what I remember, he was the first person in my kind of age cohort that talked about socialism. It's like really, this time. So this is 1962. Right, for us. And he talked about socialism, not anything deep or whatever, but, he was a kind of different guy, and that was the kind of thing like, oh, okay, what is that about? This is also the time I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and people being kind of on edge that, the people might have to go to war. And, but people kind of saying, well, no, not me, I'm not going, whatever. These are young high school students, expressing that kind of sentiment. So there was that. But we didn't have much organization or anything like that. This is, like I said, up 61 to 63 at our particular school at that time. But I mean, there was consciousness that was developing. The school was kind of like on the border between the black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And in the earlier years, maybe in the late 50s, when the integration really started in the schools, there were conflicts between the two groups of folks. That when and I don't think, it's just, kids, young people, territory, this kind of stuff. But by the time we were there weren't any real super tensions like that. Folks kind of got along. I read some on Facebook and some of these groups now where a lot of my fellow students, alumni, some who I didn't know, but they just, post on Facebook, how great it was, and there were no conflicts, there was nothing, everything was just wonderful. And I say, well, I don't remember it being that great. People kind of coexisted together, and there were little groups of folks that kind of hung out sometimes, but not a high level of unity and cohesion, but just kind of living together and getting along a little bit. Mm.
Yeah, thank you. You're giving us a lot to chew on.
Okay.
You're writing papers in school about the documentary "The Hate That Hate Produced."
Yeah.
Right, about the black Muslims.
Yeah.
About Muslims, right? And I'm wondering, I want to linger on this for a second because I think it's important for thinking about how all of this knowledge and the culture you're consuming is shaping your politics as you're moving forward in your life. Mm-hmm. Socialism's in the air, right? 1962, that's when the book The Other America comes out, Michael Harrington, mm-hmm. right? But you're also talking about, human relations clubs, social or human relations, where it's kind of liberal administrators trying to address the issue of race relations.
Exactly.
It's a few different strands of thought and politics all come into play in your young life and among the people that you're engaging with. How much did this early period in your life shape the man that you became as an eventual organizer?
Well, I guess a lot, but I don't recall any kind of, big aha moments or anything like that. What I do know, I went to school after I graduated from Jackson. I went to school at Bradley University in Peoria, mm-hmm. Illinois, mainly because I didn't get into Michigan State.
That's where you wanted to go?
Yeah. I went to Bradley, and I thought I might have a shot. The coach told me I might have a shot at the track team there, not a scholarship, but I went, and they had a little reputation as being a great basketball school. Not that I played, but you wouldn't mind being at a school with a great team. The great Chet Walker was a product of Bradley. So I went, And I think the black student population, I think we were probably, the school population, as I recall, is maybe about 5,000, something like that. And I think we had maybe 100 black students, the majority of which were athletes, basketball team, football team. That was it. And I remember the basketball team had won the NIT that year, and so big stuff. But towards the end of that year that I was there, ended up being in a civil rights, civil disobedience action that I kind of fell into by accident, so to speak. I had a job washing dishes at a local restaurant, and when I got off work this one night, I was walking back to the campus and saw a crowd gathering around a barber shop. And the barber shop was a white barber shop in the area, and it had refused to cut the hair of a classmate of mine, actually a guy, I think his name was James Felton. He was from New York, he was from Harlem, I remember that much. And he actually was wearing his hair natural at that time, so he didn't have a big bush, but wearing his hair natural. But he was, he went there and they refused him, and got some folks from the local NAACP to demonstrate in front of the house, and it spilled out over into the street, and we ended up sitting in the middle of the street blocking traffic, and we were arrested as a result of that. Spent a couple of hours in jail and got out. And it's kind of interesting. We always laugh about it because it said, I would not go there to get my hair cut anyway, right? And how many, folks, that's not like a normal target for desegregation. There's not, maybe a restaurant, and you could argue some restaurants, maybe you wouldn't want to eat at anyway, right? But definitely not the barbershop or a beauty parlor or something like that. But that's what they chose, and that was that. And so that was like my first action in a kind of conscious way where I knew, I was doing, this was part of what was going on. So,
yeah, we'll come back to that in just a moment. What years did you attend Bradley University?
From 63, just 1 year, the 63, 64 freshman year, yeah.
And then did you transfer to another school?
Yeah, transferred to West Virginia State University. It was
HBCU?
Now University, used to be West Virginia State College. Yeah, it's a HBCU in Institute, West Virginia.
And had you chosen a major? Did you know what you wanted to study before you came to Bradley?
Sociology was what my major, and history. That was the two things. Yeah.
And I want to return to this idea, right? 100 black students in a school of 5,000, predominantly white students, I imagine. What did that feel like to be in that racial minority on campus at that time?
Yeah, kind of interesting because, like, I go from a high school that was pretty much 50-50, right, and a neighborhood that was totally black to this kind of environment. And so it's a very, difficult kind of feeling. I mean, the dormitory that I lived in, and I had a white roommate. I don't think there were any other black students in my particular dorm, but no incidents of outward discrimination or whatever, but just the general environment. And we used to have a joke. I can't remember what the number was. It might have been 88 or 99, something like that. If 2 or 3 black people got together, we would say the number and we can't do this because they worry about people congregating together like that. And so we had that kind of thing. And then there was also a relationship with the town of Peoria, Richard Pryor's town, right? And people would go there to go to parties, and sometimes at risk of getting beat up or run back up to the campus because people in town, particularly the guys, didn't want students coming down there interfering with their social life. So there was that. But it's there was a black fraternity, the Alphas. I started to pledge, but I didn't finish the pledge class. But that was it. I left Bradley not so much because of those conditions, but I was kind of looking for a kind of different experience, and I was hearing from friends who were at Howard and West Virginia State what they were doing, and I said, yeah, let me join them at West Virginia State.
What was different about being in the Midwest versus a city like New York?
Well, so Peoria is, definitely a small city and whatnot. It's a really country, really almost rural area. And so it's different. The campus, though, is attracted people. I think the largest percentage of students were from like the Chicago area. And so they kind of brought that feel to it. But the Midwest, it was just different, just the small size. We didn't interact too much with the social life other than small pockets in the black community. So I missed that. And trips to Chicago were really good. I really became familiar with Chicago.
Did you like Chicago?
Oh, yeah. I liked it. It was interesting.
Had you heard about the music scene in Chicago at all from New York?
No, well, right away we got it. This is the period of Curtis Mayfield, and actually the Impressions first, right? And that we were listening to that music. And 63, the Motown sound wasn't like boom, as big. It was just beginning to emerge, I think. But the Impressions and that kind of group, and the dancing that folks did and what they listened to, not so much the blues. I mean, I knew about the blues, and of course I was a jazz enthusiast, but I mean, I've kind of like just soaked up the kind of current music that young people were listening to and really, really liked it. And I said, I could live in Chicago. But that kind of having friends from Chicago, a few from New York, and getting to Chicago every once in a while really helped me, get through that year in the Midwest.
So we're gradually making our way south and heading to the world of HBCUs and eventually HBCU
Sure.
radio. But before I get there, as a young person growing up in New York, did you, with your family, return to the South, to North Carolina or to South Carolina, maybe to visit other family?
So let me kind of back up to the South. So, I mean, I kind of grew up with the kind of legacy of New Bern, and Charleston is ever all the time, and, talking about it. My father used to go back home from time to time, and his brother. And I believe it was 1954, somewhere in there, I took a trip with my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, to Wilmington and to New Bern. And I just remember, hanging out with cousins and climbing trees and eating tomatoes off of the vine, drinking Dr. Pepper, and, running in streets barefooted like they did. Kind of remember that. But the other thing that kind of deals with, I guess, maybe consciousness, I just remember in terms of public transportation, the shift from, riding anywhere in the bus to moving to the back of the bus. We took the bus. And I remember that kind of struck me as, I don't know if it was 10 years old, something like that, but I kind of remember that piece. But that was Wilmington and New Bern. And then on my mom's side, the Charleston legacy was always there. My grandmother didn't have a heavy Charlestonian or Geechee accent, but her sister, my aunt, my grandaunt, she did, and we would hear that all the time. And they would talk about Charleston, and there was a story of my grandmother's brother, Sancho. They lived on Johns Island, and he had gone off. He disappeared, and the story was he went off to find some money that he had buried, and he never came back. And who knows? I mean, we don't have any super evidence of that, but it kind of fit the narrative that some racist found him and took his money and killed him or whatever. Nobody took it. As part of that, that's the story. But Sancho disappeared. That was it, right?
Well, thinking about the South and Jim Crow North versus Jim Crow South, what it was like in New York and what you're seeing when you're visiting down South, what it felt like when you're told to get to the back of the bus.
Yeah, or waiting rooms or in the bus terminal, waiting in one section, not being able to drink water, those things.
You felt that.
Yeah,
it felt different.
You could say, okay, I didn't have a way to process that, so it's just part of my memory as things that were confronted. I didn't come to a kind of consciousness that I got to do something about that, or why do we have to live like that? But it's just like, this is the way it is,
Yeah. Okay, and you visited with family, as you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Any other differences, maybe in terms of the environment or the landscape? What did it feel like to see the world around you in the South?
Well, I mean, for both New Bern and Wilmington, space, that kind of thing. Both places that we stayed at houses, in houses, not in apartments, and that kind of thing, and some unpaved streets, and as I pointed out, barefoot kind of situations, climbing trees, just a kind of openness that we didn't have in the city, because you're kind of confined to one area. So I remember that. I just remember that, and people being friendly in the black community. So, but I mean, at that time I didn't have identity. I wasn't a teenager where people would pay attention to me. It's like, oh, he's from New York, or this or that. I was just a real youngster with that. But I just remember that, and of course being hot. It's hot. The temperature's different. But there was always that Southern kind of thing, and particularly like on the dad's side. Like I said, my mom, she never went to Charleston or she hadn't gone to Charleston until I got married, right? And she and my dad came to meet my in-laws, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and stayed for a week or so, and they really got to know each other. But that was her first time being in her mother's home of Charleston. There wasn't this, as far as I know, my grandmother never went back. She never went back. So there was that difference. But we always we're from the South. Our people come from the South. Even though my mother and her siblings all were born in New York.
Mm. Mm. We'll get to that wedding and meeting your wife. Mm-hmm. But tell me a little bit about West Virginia State and continuing your undergraduate work. What did you make of that place?
Yeah, so West Virginia was interesting. I had heard about the kind of social scene. 3 friends from high school were there, so I decided to make this move. And another friend who I grew up with and ran track with, and who lived 1 block over from me, we together transferred and we became roommates there. So West Virginia State was in a rural area of West Virginia, about 16 miles outside of Charleston, in a small town called Institute. And so there's really not much an institute, but the institution. But next to it, Union Carbide, there was a big plant there. And we always laugh at that when I first got there, it was in the evening, and we see all these lights, right? And thinking that, oh, this is, that's the city or something. And what as it turned out, it's the plant with the lights on it. And it was so close, you could hear announcements on the intercom, telling people to do this or that or whatever. It was that close. If the wind was blowing right or whatever, you could actually hear those sounds. But the campus itself was a great place, not as large as some of the other HBCUs for sure, but a interesting place. A lot of folks from New York and D.C., Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, even L.A. a couple, and then southern states. There's a big contingent from South Carolina when I was there, and then West Virginia, black students from West Virginia. But what was interesting about it and different than probably most other HBCUs, that post Brown versus the Board of Education, post 1954, the campus becomes integrated, okay? And the administration, the board made a decision then to kind of open up the campus, right? And allow, and not just allow, but to actually encourage local white students to come to the school. So it had a pretty large commuting population from the surrounding area, from Charleston, of course, and places like Dunbar, St. Albans, and other places in the area. And so during the day, it looks like almost a integrated campus. And after classes are over, it's a black campus again. All the dormitories were peopled by black students. All of the campus life. There was some contention though over student government. Who's going to run the government? And for the most part, during that time, the 3 years I was there, that black students ended up winning elections to be, the SGA president, and so on. Every once in a while, some competition around the kings and queens and all of that during homecoming. But it was that kind of environment. And classes were integrated, of course, because you got folks. It didn't matter what majors. I think people were across the board in terms of academic programs, and there was that. But also some activity in Charleston and other places around civil rights stuff. I think there was a demonstration about a roller rink, a skating rink that black students wanted to be able to get into, and local people as well. And so people mobilized for that. So there was, that kind of thing. But the flavor of it was a black university. That was the main culture of it. And you can find this. The Ebony Magazine did a special on this campus. That there's both West Virginia State and Bluefield State, which is Bluefield, West Virginia. The two. Actually, there were 3 HBCUs in West Virginia at one time. But by this time, West Virginia State and Bluefield were the 2 remaining ones, and it also had a white population too. And Ebony Magazine came down and did interviews of people like, what was it like? What did it actually mean? But there was also a current there of people who were interested in civil rights, and had a sociology professor who would bring people to campus to have conversations. I think they brought somebody in from CORE. I remember, somebody from the Socialist Workers Party was invited to come in, a candidate. I don't know who the candidate was that year, but came and spoke. So you had that kind of openness. I mean, it wasn't like a Howard University type of environment in terms of rights and whatnot, but just people beginning to talk about it. And I know that in probably next to my last year there, we had a little demonstration to support the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We had a Friends of SNCC chapter. Didn't get very far, but
you were involved
yeah,
in this
yeah,
work.
yeah.
And you continued to study sociology?
Yeah, yeah.
And tell me a little bit about, well, first of all, did you ever hear HBCU radio during your HBCU experience?
No, because they didn't have a radio station
Okay.
then at all.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And did you pledge? Tell me about homecoming. What was the culture of the HBCU campus life, and what did you involve yourself in socially?
By that time, like as I said, I had started the pledge, A Phi A Alpha. And when I got there, two things happened. One, most of the folks that I knew that I was hanging out with from New York, they were Qs or pledging Q. And that the Alpha folks were cool, but I just, didn't feel like that was what I wanted to do. But gradually, I kind of got this sense of like, I don't need to be in something that excludes people. It wasn't a hard and fast kind of thing at that time. And we kind of even had a mocking kind of organization. We had formed a group called Wine Sci-Fi. And that was we drank wine and actually had chapters in I think at Howard University, West Virginia, and I think at Central University. Nothing formal. We certainly not Divine Nine. Yeah,
I love it. Yeah. Okay. Moving forward, what are you thinking about when you're in school about what you want to do next, and give us a little bit of a trajectory here on what you chose to do and involved yourself in after finishing up in West Virginia.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but history and sociology, those are the things that move me, and I thought I would, maybe do something in social work. I wasn't thinking about graduate school, anything like that at the time. Malcolm X is, I'm trying to think of, so I think it's the summer of 60.
What year did you graduate?
66.
Okay.
I think the autobiography was out. And I spent that summer, I kind of recall a friend of mine from New York, Jimmy Fisher, who recently passed. We were roommates, and he always reminded me, you spent the whole summer reading the autobiography. So that was kind of moving and, kind of figure out what to do.
While you're on that subject, Malcolm gets assassinated right in 65. Did you find yourself on any particular line of the freedom struggle? Did you see yourself more with Malcolm than, say, a Martin? I don't want to emphasize differences. I think there's more unity than difference, but did you think about the different lines of organizing within the movement? Right.
At that time, I hadn't made the kind of ideological distinction between the two. Of course, what Dr. King was doing was great, was important, and to the extent that we did the demonstration in Peoria. And so on. It was in the line of civil disobedience, and
right.
There was that. But also being attracted to Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the work that they were doing, which was nonviolent and not, in a sense, anti-King at all. That we so that was okay. But then Malcolm becomes a figure. Like I said, that going back to the Hate That Hate Built, seeing him there, reading Muhammad Speaks over the years, and seeing the autobiography, it's like, Malcolm is right. Need to think about that, but not in religious terms, not in spiritual, but just the kind of black nationalist understanding of how you get to freedom. We've got to fight. We've got to unite. We got to fight against white supremacy. We've got to build black institutions and so on. That was there.
And did it feel like there were limitations to nonviolent civil disobedience?
Well, yeah, that we can't leave ourselves unarmed. In both, you need protection some kind of way to make sure that our community isn't harmed, and so that that evolves into an understanding of a place for self-defense in it, but not in a way that calls for armed insurrection. It wasn't a Black Panther kind of analysis at that point for me. Yeah.
But do you recall a figure such as Robert Williams?
Yeah, Robert Williams, who coincidentally went to West Virginia State. When we were there, though, I had no idea about that. Hadn't put all that together. Yeah, but of course, Robert Williams, as I kind of studied the civil rights movement and understood the kind of position that he took in Monroe, and the support he got from the small but growing Black nationalist movement, became something that was important. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're figuring out how you want to use this knowledge of history, of sociology, of how we relate to one another as human beings. Do you go back to New York for a time as you're trying to figure out life, or do you remain in the South?
We went to New York. We got married.
Hey, tell me about your wife, if you can.
So Rukia is my wife, Rukia Dillahunt. She was English, Rukia English, Elaine English at that time, of course, before we changed our names, from Charleston, and we were friends from when I arrived there in '64, but didn't start really hanging out until maybe late '66, '67 when she was a senior, and we just enjoyed each other. She had a great sense of humor. Liked to dance. She liked New Yorkers. Her roommate was a sister from New York, Norma Van Riel, and we hung out together. She came to New York and decided, let's get married. So that was in '67.
And she involved herself in some movement work early on in the '60s as well, right? Did she participate in any struggles?
Yeah, at home in Charleston, I think there was some activity around boycotting. I'm not remembering whether it's Woolworths or one of the other stores of that nature in Charleston. There's a big movement around that. In fact, Minerva Brown, I think, writes about that in her book, the movement in Charleston. But yeah, I think, Rukia was kind of, was not in town when it started, but then they came and jumped into that. She was involved in the demonstration in West Virginia around the skating ring. And plus she was pretty defiant of ways that restricted people in South Carolina and in West Virginia too. So she talked about it, and she was not going to take any mess from white people, so on. Because it's kind of interesting. She was saying that until she came into West Virginia and went to classes, she didn't have a whole lot of exposure to white people because of the segregation in Charleston at the time, and so. That was a new experience for her. But yeah, she was good. And then plus, like I said, my grandmother was from Charleston, so that was like, hey, I'm from Charleston. I tell people now I'm a twice Geechee, my grandmother and my life partner. So yeah, but she came to New York and we got married. And
well, yeah. Tell me about the significance of education in her life as well.
In her life?
Mm-hmm.
Well, her dad was a principal of elementary school, and Henry P. Archer, and that was, so she saw that all along. He had gone to Morehouse. He was a graduate of Morehouse, and he always told a story about meeting Dr. Du Bois when he was there. Dr. Du Bois lived in the dormitory, I think, for a while they were at Morehouse, and how he admired him and even used to wear a goatee. And, because he saw Dr. Du Bois. And then he tried to engage Dr. Du Bois in conversation and stuff, and Dr. Du Bois was kind of dismissive of him. And he said, I cut off my goatee. I stopped wearing the goatee because I lost respect for him. And I always just say, J.D., which his name is Joseph English, I said, well, that was just one thing, with you, but he did some other great things. But he was an educator. And was a principal at the elementary school, but also worked at a high school, night school and whatnot. And so, Rukia comes up in that environment of education. It's just, what are you going to do? And she started out wanting to be in physical therapy. She majored in physical education and was going to go to physical therapy, but then switched to special ed and got special ed, had a few jobs doing that, and then eventually became an administrator. But all of this, during this time, particularly when we moved south, while she was here, was engaged with the union and became a local president for a couple of years. And so she was doing a kind of interesting take. On one hand, she's a union leader, but she also becomes an advocate for students and parents. So, a lot of times there's conflict between the two groups, and she was able to try to bring that together. That was one of her legacies. And, now as we walk through the streets of Raleigh, it's always, great to see people, who say, Miss D, you saved my life, I'm sorry for giving you hell. And she always told me, you gave yourself hell. So, but she's well known. And as a result, my youngest daughter is a teacher. My oldest granddaughter is a teacher as well. And then my grandson is in education too. So the legacy is kind of there.
Okay. I promise we're going to get us to Shaw and WSHA and your eventual involvement in Black radio and HBCU radio. But I have to just go back to New York for a second. You're a newlywed couple. You're making choices about work and life. I need to ask about work and, the industries that you worked in and how you got ultimately involved with, I believe, the Postal Service. Well, we'll get there, but tell me the work that you did in this as a young adult. And then I know you make the choice to go to grad school as well eventually. So give me a sense of how those decisions are being made and what you end up doing.
Yeah, so I actually got a job at State University of New York in New Paltz. Not working directly on campus, but it was a program. A friend of mine had gotten he worked there and got a grant to do a program with people who had dropped out of school. It was kind of return to school, reentry, and hired me to actually do counseling with that group and some teaching, and I did. Eventually got a job on the campus while I was going to graduate school there at SUNY New Paltz in African Studies.
One of the first programs in the country.
It's kind of interesting. If people critiqued it now, would say it was full of colonial professors, many who had worked under colonial administrations in Africa. But they had 3 or 4 Africanists, so it was kind of interesting a program. There were a few Africans that were in the department. It was a small department, though. but yeah, one of the early ones. And as you mention it now, Will, I don't even know if they still have that program. It was due to the student uprisings of the late 60s, the school changed the curriculum requirements and required, I think it was 6 credits of non-Western that you had to take to graduate. They had those distributive requirements at the time, but they added that. And so you could take something Africa, Black Studies, Asian Studies, Native American Studies, or whatever, but you had to take that. And so, faculty came in based on that, and it was a pretty good thing. But that was important. So I was interested in teaching at that time and getting a PhD, and I kind of started that work at SUNY Albany, commuting. But in the meantime, my political life, and we could talk a little bit more about that. If we want to go south and then go back to in the north.
Take us on the journey.
Yeah, but was to go south, that this was a place to do political work, and also to gauge more with the working class in terms of being involved in the labor movement, in the plants and whatnot.
What sparked that interest? Was it working yourself?
No, I mean just a kind of the movement in the Black freedom movement towards understanding of the power of the working class, and a kind of move from cultural nationalism to another kind of orientation, revolutionary nationalism, Marxism, all of those things, to understand the role of class in our struggle here, and a kind of anti-capitalist orientation. So you look at organizing the working class as being fundamental to building a strong Black movement. And
you're engaging with these ideas in grad school with others.
Yeah.
Okay, continue. Sorry to interrupt. Just continue with the eventual move down to North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, so it was based on politics and on family. We wanted to come south. Rukia is from South Carolina. Her parents are there. My parents, when they retired, moved to Virginia. And so they were a great distance away. We had, 2 daughters at the time, and actually a third one just before we moved. And we could be closer to them, but we could also be in a place where there was some political work going on, like the legacy of the movement in North Carolina rather, was there, from SNCC, doing some work here, the Greensboro sit-ins, just that history. And at the time, Malcolm X University had been here in Greensboro, the Student Organization for Black Unity, and Youth Organization for Black Unity was here in North Carolina, and that was helped attract us to come to this state.
And you moved right to Raleigh?
We came to Raleigh, but we could have just as easily been in Durham, but Rukia got a job in Raleigh first, and so we moved here. And
you're mentioning some of these organizations and institutions, Malcolm X Liberation University. Who are you engaging with, and what are some of the issues that are concerning you and Rukia specifically?
Well, two things. By the time we come, Malcolm X University is gone.
Oh, it's gone at that point?
Yeah, it's gone by then. Yeah,
okay. And that's Howard Fuller and others kind of helped organize that.
Owusu, Sudoku, and others. And then in Greensboro also, connected to but separate from that, Nelson Johnson and the Youth Organization for Black Unity, which was an important young people's organization that had a Pan-African outlook, published an important paper, African World, and they were doing work in the plants, doing education work, and so that's something we, tried to connect with at the time.
And how significant is that a part of the strategy of organizing, the relationship between education and labor? Say more about that if you can.
Well, I think that thinking of the campaigns that people were doing around education, one of the campaigns at that time, 1978, 79, was a new requirement was put in for graduation, and it was a state requirement. I'm trying to think. It was a competency test that was required, and so people were organizing against that. That it was a requirement that was added on top of normal, graduation requirements, passing X number of classes or whatever, but this competency test. And people just saw that as another roadblock to black and working class graduation and, moving on either to higher education or, out into the workforce and whatnot, where they could earn a decent living. And so, of course, that campaign wasn't widespread. It was in Greensboro, a little bit in Raleigh. We engaged with it. We didn't prevail in that, but that was just dealing with education at that time. It also, I think, kind of connected to teacher organizing, that teachers that needed to be organized. And at that time, the prevailing the organization was the NCAE, but people saw themselves as a professional organization and not a union, right? And so, part of Rukia's work all those years was like trying to develop a union concept. We're a union, we're fighting for rights on the job. We're no different than, the textile workers union or, the Teamsters or the steel workers or whatever. We're organizing our workplace. And so that's been part of it, and connecting it to the labor movement as a whole. I think at that time, Will, if I'm not mistaken, there was a small chapter of the American Federation of Teachers here at that time. They were represented teachers in Chapel Hill, and they may still be one of the only locals in the AFT. And they were on the base at what is now Fort Liberty, but Fort Bragg. They had a chapter there. They were, AFT. So there's that teacher organizing, that labor organizing in that sense. And so, Rukia was kind of a part of that. And I'm remembering a time when she was president of the local, the school board here was considering privatization of a couple of functions. They had a fair for privatization for transportation, for custodians, custodial services, transportation, and food services, all of those things. And that's when that wave of privatization was really taken over. And so at that time, I was president of the local APWU local here in Raleigh.
Postal workers.
Postal workers. And so we joined them in a picket and protest to say that we oppose privatization. At that time, the post office then, as it is now, is always under threat of privatization. And so we kind of joined together to actually do that. Again, another victory, at least a victory in terms of the transportation. Still, it's controlled, by the board now, no outside companies, but they had a lot of outside companies trying to provide transportation services. So they won that battle. The food service, I think, was contracted out, and I think the custodials is partially contracted out. But that was one time where we had some unity, did some joint work from our two unions working on the same issue.
You mentioned the Postal Workers Union. Give me a sense of that transition. I believe my research tells me you worked as a machinist or as a steward eventually, but tell me about that first entry point into the postal, into your work as a postal worker?
Yeah, well, my dad was a postal worker, mentioned that, and I worked in the post office in, let's see, maybe 3 years during the holiday rush. They hire people, and so when I was not in school, I would work in the post office. So kind of had that experience, that sense. Went in, and my first job, I was a clerk, just distributing mail manually. Later on, working the letter sorting machines that were used at that time, flat sorter machine. Had about 6 or 7 different jobs that I've been on during that time. But early on, coming in, started attending union meetings and, learning about the contract, learning what was going on, and kind of sizing up the nature of our local and what were the shortcomings in the leadership, and whether or not we could do something about it if there were other people that felt like there were shortcomings as well. And we kind of got together and built a caucus, and eventually ran for office and won. Yeah.
And what were your strategies in appealing to your fellow workers?
Well, that we got to build a kind of militant approach to dealing with management. That just not to be rosy. We had a collective bargaining agreement that allows you to file grievances, and that we need to use it, just to be rigorous with it, and need to involve employees, the members, as much as possible in that process. And so it's not just the stewards, talking to management, but that we involve the employee, the grievant, so to speak, and so that they're all part of it. But also allowing, the rest of the membership to know what's going on. So, there's some of the grievances that were personal, firings or whatever, disciplinary stuff, that's kind of something between the local, the employee and the steward and the management. But there are broader issues of contract violations, not overtime or health and safety conditions and heat, just all of that, and where everybody needs to be involved. And so, trying to involve people that way. And we did that. I was successful. I think my first election was in 84, and I stayed in office until 2004.
And is that about when you retired from the post office?
Yeah.
Thank you. Now we're in the 80s, right?
Okay.
Right? Reagan era, but also a time that historians of African American history are trying to make note of as a time of real activism, especially in a state like North Carolina. You played a critical role in the organization Black Workers for Justice, and I want you to give me sort of the origin story on that organization and what some of the campaigns were about.
Mm-hmm. Well, the evolution of the Black Workers for Justice comes out of a struggle in Rocky Mount of several black women who were fired and harassed at a Kmart in Rocky Mount. At that time, some members who later became founders of Black Workers for Justice, Saladin Muhammad and his wife Naima, had moved from Philadelphia. They had come out of the Black Liberation Movement, but they were both from North Carolina, and they moved back to do some work, kind of like in the same way that Rukia and I came back to contribute to the Southern movement and to work with the black working class in the South. And so they got involved with the Kmart struggle. And there's a lot of people are writing on it. In fact, my grandson is writing on that, the evolution of the organization and that struggle in Kmart. Rocky Mount had its own history of some labor struggle, and the years before that, I think the sanitation workers strike in Rocky Mount. People think of when they think about sanitation strikes in the South, they think about Memphis and Dr. King, but there was a strike in Rocky Mount in '78, I believe it was, that was important. Wasn't as huge, but it was important locally. Mm-hmm. One of the workers, Alexander Evans, had been fired, accused of taking some clothing that had been put out on the street to be discarded, and of him stealing that, and they fired him, and the workers said, no, we're not going to tolerate this, and they went on strike. They had to organize and drive. The local clergy was involved in it, other social movement organizations, and they eventually got him his job back. And so that was a kind of social basis for the work in Rocky Mount by the time we get to Kmart. And getting them involved. Eventually, after the Kmart struggle was over and kind of showed the community a face of kind of active organizing of workers. Like, this is a workers' issue, not just a general civil rights or black community issue, but specific issues that relate to the black working class. The Black Workers for Justice was formed. Some work had been done in other parts of Eastern North Carolina to identify workers. So,
what other sectors as well, in addition to retail?
In addition to retail, in poultry and in manufacturing, in right around the Rocky Mount area, but also some other areas in the eastern part of the state, Clinton. Tarboro, Wilson, later on Greenville, where people came from. Those are the folks that came together to form the Black Workers for Justice. In Fremont, we did some work in Fremont later on, and so it was bringing together black workers from those industries. Later on in the story, the public sector comes in, where campaigns for the public sector. But before that, we had a Know Your Rights campaign to let people in local plants know that they had certain rights under the law, even though that there was right to work laws in terms of restrictions on collective bargaining. But that there were other rights that people had, and that they should exert them. And that Know Your Rights campaign has an impact later on the work at Shaw, which I'll talk about.
Yeah. You're describing this time of transition, right? The political economy is transitioning. A lot of workers are transitioning from industry to retail, and the politics of it, as you said, is, the South is a right to work state, or it's becoming even more of a right to work state. Some of those protections that workers had fought for and won in, say, the World War II and post-war era, that's beginning to unravel a little bit. And you're saying there's an active black-led presence trying to organize workers and make sure that they understand their rights and to fight for their rights. Did it feel successful?
Yeah, well, in terms of raising the consciousness of people, because there's this sense that you can't organize the South, workers are scared, we've not been successful in the past, and there's limited organizing going on. I mean, there's AFL-CIOs here, and they're trying to rumble, but that the kind of resources that needed to come in from all the unions just wasn't there. So we always organize in the context of the slogan, organize the South. That's our mantra, organize the South. And we build up campaigns around that, taking that north to people in the Midwest, in the Northeast, and even the West Coast, trying to get labor activists to convince their international or their national unions to really engage in Southern organizing in a big way.
And there's a legacy there, right, from on the left with the American Communist Party and the work that they did in the 30s among black agricultural workers in the South. Do y'all think about the work that you're doing in the 80s as a part of that legacy of efforts to unite the black working class in the South?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, while the Black Workers for Justice brought in rank and file workers from different organizations, some of the founders and leadership, had that history as part of their legacy. Not that they were part of it, but they knew it. They'd studied that. They knew what was going on. And so this was in that legacy, the organizing the South. But you had to do it. You had to get out there. So one, encouraging national unions to come to the South, right? In the process, though, we developed our own approach to organizing that isn't restricted by NLRB elections. And winning majorities and getting a contract, which is this is what you want to do.
That's the goal.
Eventually, that's the goal. But on a basic level, workers need some kind of organization in their workplace, something, right, to deal with discrimination, to deal with sexism, to deal with health and safety issues. These are the kind of basic issues that confront workers every day.
Yeah, and on that front, why is collectivizing so important in such an individualistic society like America?
Well, I mean that's what happens, and people have been led to believe that you can do this on your own as long as you carry your weight, go to work, do a good job. You're okay, and that's always when you bring that up, it makes you think of the kind of approach that bosses always took, like, our doors are open, you can come see us and whatnot. Your relationship is with me, with the manager or the supervisor. You don't need anybody else to speak for you. And so that's the kind of way of creating a wedge between workers and unions. And the idea that the union is some outside entity and that, in fact, it's not you. That's it. And that's been part of our approach, to say that you, the worker on the shop floor, right, you are the union. Eventually you'll be the union. You may be the workplace committee or whatever, but you build inside and start to tackle those issues that you have there on the workroom floor. One of the things that we continue to use, so many companies have an employee handbook, right, of some sort. Not a contract, it's an employee handbook. To use that handbook to force them to do things, right? Using whatever kinds of resources are at our disposal to actually get people organized and to build something in each plant and whatnot. And that's still what we carry on, because, with organized labor coming in from the outside, organizing for an election is not successful, they might be moving on somewhere else, right? But those workers are still there. And if you've built a successful internal structure based on the people that actually work there, with leadership and some sense of how you move things, you've got a chance maybe to do another election, or to at least fight for those things that confront you on a regular basis. So having an organization is really important.
Thank you. Let's connect this to Shaw, the radio station WSHA, which is the focus of this conversation, believe it or not. Was the radio soundtracking these campaigns? And, in answering that question, when do you first learn about WSHA as a radio station? Okay,
that I can answer. But when you're going to get to this question of when the program started, you're going to have to tell me, because I can't remember the year it started. But I think your research will have to do that. But the station per se, let me just take us a little bit back to some history. before we moved to North Carolina, we would visit Rukia's cousin in Durham. And during that time, you always on the radio, you want to get to the lower end. We say the left end of the radio is where all the black programs are, whether AM or FM. That's where they were. But we would hear the radio station in Durham. The call letters escaping me now, but some graduates of Central had the radio station.
WFAR?
Yes, that's it. I think that's it.
Was a publicly owned black radio station.
That's right. They
first,
came out of that, yeah. And the stuff that they had on, I mean, it's just one of the founders, he just passed, who actually ended up being a postal worker, Obatayi Akamoli. He was one of the founders, but they had just like music was just mad. It was just, jazz and all of that. Really hot R&B music, but also political kinds of influence. They play speeches or excerpts of speeches by Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X or Angela Davis or whatever. And so it was a really progressive radio thing. So that's when we're coming down to visit and thinking about moving, saying, wow, this is good, right? We end up in Raleigh, as I said, not Durham, but there's another station, is WSHA, that's on the air, and playing jazz and R&B, and some discussions, some programs with talk radio. I'm not even remembering in '78 which programs were on at the time, but it was a way to tune into the black community. There was WLLE was the AM station that had a lot of community programming, but WSHA and I remember this faculty member O.A. Dupree was one of the people that we met who kind of gave us the history of the radio station. But yeah, we listen to it, and it's jazz. So it's got to be on in the car all the time. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, thinking about a long-running program like Margaret Rose Murray's Traces of Faces and Places, would that have been on at that time?
So it seems like it. It's funny, and I don't know if you've interviewed Rhonda Muhammad yet, her daughter.
We plan to.
Yeah, we knew Traces of Faces and Places as a coloring book that they had for the school, the Vital Link School, and so we had seen that, and that was a way of them doing history for young people, and that became the name of the radio program. I'm not sure if 78, 79, if they were on yet, maybe a little later than that. But yeah, that was part of the legacy.
And you said you don't remember exactly when you began your own program, but I do want you to kind of think about what range of time that may be, and just, tell me what that program was, what it was called, and what your intent or mission with that program was.
Well, let me start with what it was called.
Yeah.
Okay. So it was called Justice Speaks, and that comes from our Black Workers for Justice had a newspaper called Justice Speaks. Started out as a one-sheet newsletter, and then went to one of those 11 by 17 foldeds, and then actually then went to a tabloid, became a tabloid that was published, once a month for a number of years. And so it was Justice Speaks. So when we got the opportunity to have the radio program, we're going to call it Justice Speaks, because it's the same thing, taking the message out to people about their rights, about how people were struggling in other workplaces, how they were struggling in other communities, and even what's going on nationally and internationally that people need to know about. And so It was Justice Speaks. The first couple of months, we had I think we had a half an hour, but we did it. A co-worker and a fellow BWFJ person, Shafia Mbalia, she was a co-host. Shafia had been on radio at WRFG in Atlanta. People called it, and they still do, I guess, Radio Free Georgia. She had been on the radio there, so she and I were co-hosts of Justice Speaks. But she was living in Rocky Mount, and so getting in every week to do this, it just became difficult. So I ended up doing it solo. But we had that spot that was increased to an hour. What the name Justice Speaks drew us to what do we do as a theme song, okay? And we had a campaign in the workplaces called Workers Know Your Rights, okay? And we connected that with the Bob Marley, and then I think who else did it? Two versions of Stand Up for Your Rights, Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights.
Peter Tosh?
Yeah, Peter Tosh had it, Bob Marley, and there may be a third one that did it, but that was our theme song, Get Up, Stand Up for Your Rights. And that took us in and out every evening. I'm just right now just thinking of Rashad Mohammed, behind the controls, putting that on every week.
He was your engineer.
Yeah.
Do you remember anyone else in addition to Rashad at the station as a staff?
Yeah, there was a guy named Bob. Bob, and I'm trying to think of another guy that went to Elizabeth City and did their radio program. He would sometimes be engineer. And I think he recently passed.
Okay.
No, I'm not sure his name, but Rashad was mainly the one.
And again, trying to get a sense of the time frame. Are we talking late 80s into the 90s?
Yeah.
Mostly 90s?
Yeah, late 80s into the 90s because...
or do you know when it ended roughly?
Yeah, in the late 90s, I think. It was a kind of sad thing. I mean, we think that the administration at that time wasn't really too happy about the program.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
The nature of it. I mean, so the nature of it is we're talking about struggles of working people. We're talking about discrimination on the job, racism. We're talking about exploitation of workers. We're talking about international affairs. We're talking about apartheid in South Africa. We're talking about all of these different kinds of things and that challenge the system, both here in the U.S. and around the globe. And so it was a kind of radical message from the point of view of some people, and particularly the administration. We were never given a real reason other than we want to go in another direction. And not an explanation of what was wrong with this direction and what direction are you going in. And as I recall, I think Brother Kenneth, Margaret Rose Murray's husband, he also had a program at that time that dealt more with business, black business development and entrepreneurship. And he was dropped too at that time. I'm not aware of exactly what they told him as well, but I think it was that, we want to change the direction. So we, at that time, and I don't know, they had those annual surveys that they had to do as part of their licensing, and I don't know how we showed up in that, but I think we were pretty popular in the area, and the broadcast area is limited, but sometime we get out to parts of eastern North Carolina, and people would hear it and call in each week. But we had, for example, for a long time, Manning Marable, the late historian and activist, had columns that he used to do for local newspapers. And we started out getting the columns and reading it. But during the course of our program life, he actually started doing an audio version. And so we would get the tapes and hand it to Rashad as we'd come in the studio, and we'd play an excerpt for that week on all manner of topics that was on it. So we've given that kind of view. We would have in-studio guests. For example, the Hamlet fire. We were able to really talk about that, to have guests, former workers that were there, people who were organizing in Hamlet, people who were trying to build for a demonstration that we had there. That was something that we were able to do. We had that voice at that time, and people would call in to announce demonstrations or pickets or issues that they were having on the job.
That's in '91, and that's a chicken processing plant.
Yes,
right?
yes.
That caught fire. So you're an actively engaged public affairs station that's also messaging right to the grassroots from folks like Manning Marable and others, and that comes into conflict with the admin of the station. Who, if you're comfortable saying, who was in charge of the station at that point?
Well, Dr. Mecca was in charge at that point. And so, and I just want I don't want to lose this point though in terms of programming stuff. We had all these guests. Some people would call in from out of town at that time. Abdullah Kalimat, the activist and historian, sociologist, he called in. I think we had Amiri Baraka called, different activists. But we also had a segment for music that we would play in between. And, I would select something that I was thinking about. Either I might bring it in and give it, or I would say, Rashad, you got something that you could play. So the kind of musical and cultural component was part of it, not just the theme song, but just music in general, and try to pick out music that was kind of movement music that was related to the struggle in some kind of way.
Can you give me some examples, maybe genre as well?
There was a group, I'm trying to think, that Jaribu Hill and her partner had, I'm trying to think of the duo, what they, some of them, Serious Business was the name of the group, Serious Business. We would play that. Of course, Sweet Honey in the Rock, we'd play their music. Sunrise sometime, but just try to connect it to movement kinds of things.
And when you're connecting with your listeners, is there any particular strategy in engaging with your listener community? Not just in Raleigh. It sounds like you had a broad listenership.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't have like a strategy where we sat down, okay, this not the kind of sophisticated communications kinds of conversations that people have today and using all of these different mediums. It's just like we've got this opportunity here. What do we want to talk about? Who do we want to hear it? How do we want them to relate to it? What do we want them to do? We just want them to call in, or we want to get them to engage something in their community, either related to what we've talked about or related to problems that they identify, but they understand now that this is what they did in this place, and maybe we can do the same kind of thing. So it's just a kind of broad approach to that. But to give people a sense of anytime you've got problems or issues, you got to come together, you got to organize, right? And so we would get calls online and people would ask questions, or people might call the station because Rashad or whoever's doing the board, they might say at the end of the program, like, this person wants you to call them. They didn't want to be on the air, but they want to talk about something, and so we would call them and talk about whatever it was that they wanted to talk about, or maybe give some tips or put them in touch with somebody else that could maybe really help them with the problem.
So process-wise, it's really important that Rashad Abdul Muhammad's kind of screening calls and relating with the listeners as you're moving.
Yeah.
And, it seems like such a valuable service of political education. Is that how you understand Black radio? How do you personally define Black radio?
Well, I think it's got to be all of that.
Yeah.
And I've heard some radio, and not necessarily HBCU radio, but just in general where it's just talk. And, it kind of gets sterile in spite of maybe the topic being important or the topics, but where people are just talking. The musical interludes, the cultural piece, really, I think is really important. In the music, and not in the music, in the programming, it's got to include the music. Today, I don't know. I listen to WNCU. It's the closest kind of thing, music-wise. Program-wise, though, I don't hear a lot of. I don't think they have the same number of talk programs that they've had in the past as well. If that's declined some.
I do want to ask where you see the legacy of your program in the local radio scene today, and maybe where do you see it? Could it be online or podcasts even?
Yeah, that's and I don't know how much people, in terms of what would have been the listening audience in that moment, to now in terms of the group that would be listening. Are they listening to radio? Are they, doing podcasts? How are they getting their information or their entertainment? Or, how do they know about stuff? And I see a number of programs now that people like have this Black Liberation Radio or Black Power Radio. They come on, they do a podcast. You got to go through Facebook or maybe Instagram or something like that to get it. I call it convenience at that time of just turning the radio on, either in the car or in the home, to get something. People had their dials fixed on one station, and that's where they are, and so they're able to pick this up, being available and looking forward to the program, each week. And some regulars would call in. It's regular people, and then you might see in the community they hadn't called in a while. They say, "Oh, we haven't heard from you. What's up?" There's that kind of thing. But today, I don't know how the surviving stations, how they get the word out to people, how they develop a listenership. That's beyond the campus community, and that just reminds me, going back to the days that we were there, and what the programming was. So there's mainly jazz programming, which I was interested in, but then there's gospel on Sunday morning or whatever, and then I guess Saturday nights, hip hop became part of it, and it was kind of like, what do you focus on, and do you give it more attention? Students coming through the communications program here, not necessarily interested in jazz, they wanted to do hip hop radio, those kind of things. But today, if the station were on, would people be tuning in? I don't know. Young people, I guess, in the area listening to Foxy, 107, those kind of things, and getting music, but not getting the kind of cultural and political discussions that we had on WSHA at that time.
Yeah. Well, WNCU is on the air. We hope, they continue to maintain a pretty pretty broad reach and listenership, but we're alluding to the fact that WSHA is no longer on the air, and that means something, right? I mean, well, we'll get to that closure in a second, but what did it mean to you personally to work or to volunteer as a DJ, as a host on an HBCU radio station?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a great feeling. I mean, I didn't have any training, wasn't preparing myself for this. Probably could have done a lot better with some training, but it was just being part of this whole enterprise. You're on a HBCU. This is an important part of the campus, and it's an important part of the community. And you get a chance to participate in that. That was really good, and maybe sometimes even cross paths with other people doing radio programs at WSHA. We never had a gathering of all the different folks, but of course, just thinking about faces, traces of face and places. The Murrays, the Muhammads, we know them very well. They're friends of our family, and our grandchildren went to the Vital Link School, so we kind of felt that camaraderie. All of that kind of came together at WSHA. And then later on, even during that program, Cash Michaels kind of took over for Miss Murray, and Cash's connection to the local black press and other community stuff. It's kind of like a rounded out the circle, the kind of communications network of things, people who were active in the community.
And did you see your program or other programs on WSHA in the legacy of Shaw's political tradition, their history of activism?
I would. Now, others, and maybe you'll get a chance to talk to John Mendez, Reverend Mendez, who was a student leader here at Shaw during that time, and was able, as I guess, student government president, have access to the airwaves. I don't know if it was on a regular scheduled basis or as needed or whatever. He'll have to fill us in on that, but I know he did have access to it and was able to use it to kind of mobilize students for different kinds of activities. I think the African Liberation Day event in 1972, he helped to kind of mobilize students and others through the radio, getting people to come out in that way. And so definitely a part of that legacy. It's sad. People are still just moaning over over the loss of it, and I still have it in my contact list, the radio station, and all of that. But it's having an institution like that, and I hope that the schools that still have the radio can see that this has to stay in some kind of way. The nature of it, the character of it is always going to be in contention. People are going to fight for what it stands for, what it does. But to have it as an institution is just so important. And I don't know about radio outside of this, just radio in general. I know of the right-wing radio stations were very much in play in the 90s and so on. And I don't know about now, the Rush Limbaughs and all them. Do they still have the kind of sway that they had then, or they moved to online?
I think it's still a major ecosystem on the AM radio and FM a little bit, but mostly AM. I think.
Is that right? Okay.
No, but thinking about the closure of the station, that happens ultimately in 2018. But what do you recall about the struggle to save the station, the grassroots effort to save WSHA?
It wasn't enough. It was weak. we didn't pull together. I don't even remember a kind of organizing center for it. Just a few people trying to do it. And you think about even now the struggle at Shaw around the zoning to make other kind of real estate decisions possible for the Shaw campus, and getting the alumni up for that. And the difficulty they had with that. Now, of course, the alumni is spread out all across the country, and getting them together to do something is really difficult. But I don't think we mobilized enough to actually try to save the station. I mean, people wrote, you write the board and write the president and all that, but something that was much more powerful and impactful needed to happen, and it kind of got away from us. And the young people had kind of shifted. They were dealing with other radio opportunities, in terms of their listening and so on. So it just wasn't the same kind of thing. I think it was a generational kind of piece of people who appreciated and depended on WSHA. And there's a much older cohort, in my opinion. I'm thinking
A few questions here as I move us towards the end. How do you feel about the HBCU Radio Preservation Project and what you see as the significance of this work?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Because it's telling a vital story. I mean, it's just as important as the story of the black press, for example. In our history, our struggle in this country, it's equally as important. I don't know that it will lead to the creation of more radio on HBCUs, and I don't know what kind of impact it's going to have on the actual preservation of those still standing. But if it can, it seems like it might. It's really important. If it leads to new kinds of configurations in terms of financing and support that people hadn't considered before, then that's good. That would be good to actually do it. But I think it's also going to be important to kind of see it, the whole picture, the map, the timeline. Those kinds of things I think will say something to us. And to me, it seems like it's a story, of course, that gets told in the audio kind of way, given that that's the medium that was used. But it's also, I think, would be great if there was a kind of documentary of it, that people are getting to see some of these folks that are still around or whatever, but a kind of visual depiction of what it was. And, I can only say that in this moment that we're in now, where, you worry about being able to hold on to any institutions. Somebody was saying that if you use PBS, for example, for content for your classes, for example, which there's a lot of stuff, a lot of great educational stuff, you better grab it now, because it may not be available in the next few months or years, that kind of thing, that worry about that. And so people are in the same way are developing their own history classes for communities to deal with history, because it's going to be prohibited in certain education institutions, public institutions. We have to develop our own. All of that has to happen. I think this project is part of that. And people that participate in it may not see it that way. I think probably the people who've organized the project understand that. But to finish it and get it out there, I think will be a really important plus and an important tool for us in the coming months and years.
What do you want your legacy to be?
Well, just as somebody who tried to fight back to make this a better world, you know, wanted to transform the system so that, my friend Jim Grant used to say, he just passed recently, he was an activist part of the Charlotte Three. He says, just simply that everybody gets what they need. You know, that's a kind of basic reduction of like what it is, which means a system change, which means that the world has to really be shifted in another direction, not the direction that we're in now, but that at least I saw that and tried to work with others to try to make that happen. And, you know, that, you know, a love for people, a love for different cultures was what motivated me. And that hope that I had an impact on some people, just even in a small way.
And what gives your life meaning today?
Well, you know, when you get this age, it's kind of like your children and your grandchildren, seeing what they've done and what they're about to do, being around them. That's some meaning. You know, connecting with friends from many years ago, that's some meaning. And looking at young people coming up and fighting back and taking on the issues of the day, all of that together, you know, gives some meaning. I'm just, I wish I could move around a little bit more and be in shape to run if I have to, but that's not possible now. But just watching, you know, people come up and resist the results of the George Floyd murder and the uprising there was really something that gave me hope. I felt good about that. And now the resistance to the genocide in Gaza, although not broad enough, just seeing that people are grasping it and hoping that in this moment now that people will rise up to meet the occasion, because I think, you know, we're in for a rough ride in these 4 years with the dismantling of so many of the programs that have been integral to the people, and that it looks like a fascist state is going to be in play, and how people deal with that is really important. And I hope people just rise up and resist it. Yeah.
Sounds like you're staying hopeful, and you know, you're inspired by some of the activism you're seeing, but there are some real dangers out there.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Well, I want to make sure I didn't miss anything that you wanted to say in this interview. So, you know, it's a long life, but I want to know, is there anything else you want to mention, folks you may want to shout out, or something we may have missed in our conversation today?
No, I mean, I certainly mentioned, you know, my connection to Rukia over these 56 years, so that's been important. But the friends and comrades that I worked with for the last 40-something years in Black Workers for Justice, and particularly Saladin Muhammad was one of the leaders. He's a very dear friend. He and his wife. But also, you know, people, I mentioned maybe Nelson Johnson before being an important figure in the South in the last 4 decades in terms of fighting for justice, fighting for our people. They've been important. And I just, you know, again, a shout out to the project for seeing it, and the framework that you're using for it, I think, is really good. It's going to be useful.
Well, Ajamu, it's been a great honor to talk with you and learn more about your story today, and I think it's a real important contribution to this project. So I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I hope I didn't waste it. Your time.
Not at all.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, cool.